Thank you all for joining us today. I'm very pleased to be here. My name is Julie Fine. I'm the Climate and Agriculture Specialist for American Farmland Trust New England. And we're here today to learn about reducing tillage for tobacco production, in particular for Connecticut, and of course we'll include Massachusetts as well, since we're all friendly like that. We're joined today by two experts in the field, Dr. Jim Lamondia and Dr. Andy Bailey. So we're going to sort of start out with some Zoom ground rules, and I'll introduce our speakers. All right, so we'd like to ask you all to stay muted during the presentations. We'll be taking questions using the chat function throughout the webinar. And then after each speaker, we'll leave time for them to answer questions. And at the very end, we'll leave a little more time for final questions and maybe discussion. If you can add your questions to the chat all along, that'd be great. And this webinar is going to be recorded so that we can share it for the future. So I'll start out by just briefly sharing a little bit about my organization. American Farmland Trust was founded in 1980 as a national nonprofit for agricultural conservation. Today, our mission is to save the land that sustains us by protecting farmland, promoting sound farming practices, and keeping farmers on the land. We pursue this mission strategically, both nationally and regionally. And here in New England, we received a conservation innovation grant from the Connecticut Natural Resources Conservation Service, titled Reducing Tillage in Connecticut Tobacco Production, Advancing Soil Health Practices on Connecticut's Tobacco Farms. And so as part of this project, we have our guest speakers today who are going to share some of their experience and research. First up is Dr. Jim Lamondia, who is the chief scientist and head of the Connecticut Agricultural Experiment Station Valley Laboratory until he retired just this last March. Jim's worked as a tobacco pathologist and breeder for 36 years. He's volunteering as emeritus scientist and conducts research on the biology and management of plant pathogens and nematodes on a number of crops, including tobacco, small fruits, vegetables, and ornamentals. His research focuses on the development and utilization of management strategies, fungicides and fungicide resistance, plant resistance to pathogens, and management with crop rotation and antagonistic crops. Our second speaker will be Dr. Andy Bailey, who has been a tobacco extension specialist at the University of Kentucky for the past 20 years. He's located at the UK Research and Education Center in Princeton, Kentucky. His major focus is on dark fire-cured and dark air-cured tobacco, and his major research interests include pest management, variety development, fertility, and curing methods aimed at tobacco harm reduction. In recent years, he's also conducted research with cigar wrapper production in dark tobacco and Connecticut broadly. So I'll just sort of start by giving a little context here for what we're talking about. You know, I'm particularly interested in reduced tillage, not necessarily anything that's strictly no-till, or but every little bit that we can do to protect the soil makes a big difference. This picture here is a little illustration of a no-till field on your left and a conventionally tilled field on the right side of the photograph, just right after a heavy precipitation event. You can see that left half of the field, you had nice water infiltration, no real ponding. And on the right side, you can see that there's ponding and there will be crusting, and you can see in the background there's some movement of topsoil. You know, so the primary interest here is in soil conservation, that we're able to reduce soil erosion by 75 to 95% when we leave residue on the soil surface and keep our soil aggregates stable. And that also retains nutrients in the field, so we don't lose them through as much through leaching or surface runoff. I think one of the things that interests farmers in conservation tillage is just the reduced field prep time. And these days, with fuel being what it is, reducing fuel inputs could be a major cost savings. And then, you know, all of us who've been here in in Massachusetts and Connecticut the last 5 or 6 years, you know, one July we get 12 inches of rain, and the next July we get 0 inches of rain. So thinking about this as a strategy for water conservation is really important, because in those flooding years we see real benefits in terms of water infiltration in soils that are healthier. And in drought years, we see increased water retention and therefore more available water for plants, and subsequent benefits for crop yield. You know, in addition, we have this sort of environmental aspects of reduced runoff, preventing topsoil loss and nutrient pollution that we often see in highly tilled fields. And then there's reduced CO2 emissions that are also a big benefit, both in terms of keeping carbon in our soils to maintain soil organic matter for soil aggregate stability, and also in terms of CO2 emissions. So this is sort of the, you know, why we're here and what we're interested in. And we're going to let Jim talk about his experience at the Connecticut Agricultural Research Station. And let's see, I will stop sharing my screen. Jim, are you able to share your screen?
Okay, yep, here we go. Can you see that? Is it working or no?
Not quite.
Okay, let me try it again here.
Okay.
Oh, I got to hit the share button. How's that?
There you go.
Okay.
So if you can.
Yep.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Oops.
Okay. So you've been doing this for a few years. For all the reasons that Julie just talked about. One of the things that we've seen over the whole time I've been working with tobacco is that it's tilled extensively, and we've typically have very low organic matter levels in soil. And I was interested in trying to investigate this to see if we could increase soil health, soil quality. So we've been looking at not no-till, but really strip tillage in tobacco, and I was also interested in looking at this in combination with some cover crops. There's barley pictured here, but could be other grains or other crops as well. So we've been looking at this since 2019. So we've got 4 years worth of data where we grow a grain crop, either harvest it or just burn it down. We typically subsoil and then do this strip till, and that our techniques have changed a little bit through these years as we've learned more. You can see the little tillers on the right, the subsoiling that we did through the rows, under the rows on the left. Now, one of the things you'll notice is that we have a fairly small tractor, so we don't have a lot of horsepower, so we end up going through the field multiple times, and that has some impacts on our compaction between rows, and we'll keep that in mind as we go through this. But so we're tilling strips through the field, and then we plant. You can see that, you know, we've got the strip till on the right side here, versus on the left we have our conventional tillage, and we're growing these side by side to do comparisons with C9 broadleaf. One of the things that this illustrates is that we've had some issues, especially early, and we've learned better how to deal with this. But weed control, there's some of the things that we need to be concerned about are how do we fertilize and how do we manage some of the weeds in these fields. These fields there's a long history of tobacco production on the farm. But we still have some weed issues. So when we start looking at some of our data, how does this yield compare from conventional versus our strip till? When we first started off, the first couple of years that we did this, we had some difficulties with getting the plants fertilized well and controlling weeds, as you could see in that first picture, with the result that we were not getting the same yields in our strip till that we were in our conventional. Now in 2021, even though it was a very tough year, was an extremely wet year. We were pretty close to it. We were only 8% lower in the strip till than in the conventional. And then this past year, we actually had a higher yield in our strip till plots than we did in the conventional plots, although not significantly different. Now, the reason why we did this in the first place was to try to improve soil quality, soil health, things like compaction, water permeability, trying to increase organic matter and get better structure in the soil. And we tried to measure that in a couple of different ways. What you can see here is the soil penetrometer, where we're looking at the compaction. We can actually measure how compacted the soil is. So in the last couple of years, 2021 and 2022, we made measurements between the conventional versus strip till. We took multiple measurements within the row or between rows, and found that we had significantly improved penetration, reduction in soil compaction in the strip till areas within the row. In this past year, that was also the case. Again, very significant differences between the row, between the in-row measurements between conventional and strip till. As I mentioned right up front, we ended up running a lot of equipment through the strip till plots, so that we did not have significant differences. And in fact, the compaction was worse between the rows than it was in the row. Probably not too surprising, because we're running the tractor tires right over those locations. If we were able to do this with multiple functions in a single pass, I think we would be a lot better off. Now, again, one of the things that Julie mentioned was water infiltration. And in the last 2 years, we also measured how long it took for an inch of water. We put a plastic PVC pipe into the soil, and then put in an inch of water in 2021, and measured the time for that water to infiltrate the soil. And even though the compaction levels were not significantly different between strip till and convention between rows, we still had significant differences in penetration. So I think we still had better soil structure there. 2021 was a very wet year, and you can see that we had significant differences between the strip till and the conventional. Now, this past year was a dry year. In this case, we were measuring, it was volume of water that we put in was about 2 inches, and when we measured this in seconds, again, we had significant difference between the strip till and the conventional within the row, but not between the rows. We also looked at water stable aggregates and percent organic matter. This is data from 2021, and we didn't see significant differences, and slight increases in organic matter as we went along, but these characteristics take a fair amount of time to develop, and we're not going to see that in just a couple of years. It's a long-term increase. So again, the soil health characters are slow to change. We learned a lot as we went along. Initially we had bigger issues with weeds. We had some issues with fertilizer placement, and those impacted yields. As we moved along, we've gotten better with this. We better control the weeds with herbicides, and when we apply the herbicides. Fertilizers, we've learned that we need to put the higher percentage of the total fertilizer. They both got the same dose through the season, but we put a higher percentage as pre-plant in our strip till. And we've also learned that when we side dress, we do usually 2 side dresses per season. We need to have the tubes that drop that. We use primarily meal fertilizers. They have to be right there at the base of the plant in that tilled area, where they're not just dropped onto the location between where we're driving over it between the rows. And in doing that, we're getting pretty good yields. The significant difference that we can see is in the soil compaction and the way water infiltrates the fields, especially within the rows where the plants are, most of the plant roots are. Now, this is from 2021. This is not our plots, but this is just an idea of, what are the problems when we have wet years and the fields are tilled a lot, between, you start thinking how many times tractors are running through here and beating up the soils, and even working the soil under wet conditions can be very damaging. And we had a lot of areas where the tobacco just water stood, wouldn't go through, and the plants suffered as a result of that. So again, we've learned to deal with some of these problems. We've both the fertilizer and the weed control. One of the other issues that has come up, and again, I'm a plant pathologist, so these are the things that stand out to me, are some of the potential disease problems that you wouldn't think of reduced tillage having impacts on disease problems, but actually we did see this. One of the diseases that we get here that is usually noticeable but not really consequential is tobacco ring spot. You can see these on certain plants, usually a low percentage per field. There's sort of oak leaf patterns and certain circular rings with a spot in the middle where the name ring spot comes from. Now, we often find these in the same field year after year, usually toward the edge of the field, and a very low incidence that usually doesn't have a big impact. In our strip till plots, we saw an increased incidence, and in fact, it was as high as, well, we had 4.5% of our plots over the last 2 years versus less than 0.5% in the conventional tillage right adjacent to it. Now, this ring spot virus survives or is overwinters in broadleaf weeds, which act as a reservoir, and they are vectored to tobacco by nematodes, dagger nematodes, which we don't really think of as really damaging on their own to tobacco. This virus is often, as I mentioned, worse at the edge of the field. That's often because these nematodes are adjacent to broadleaf weeds where they're picking the virus up. They're often brought in, and when you till at the edge and it moves it in, they're large nematodes, and the act of tillage actually has a pretty good impact at knocking the nematodes down. If we till the fields pretty substantially, it's about the same controlling dagger nematodes as if we were to fumigate. So when we stop tilling, these nematodes can survive better. When we have problems with broadleaf weeds, there's much more virus reservoir for those nematodes to pick up this fairly common virus and then move it to the tobacco. Now, one of the other things that we need to think about is stalk sprouts. And when we don't till at the end of the season, we have to make sure that we somehow kill those sprouts so they don't resprout, continue to keep that root system alive, almost have a ratoon crop, as you can see in some of these pictures. This is not a reduced tillage, but it can happen in conventional tillage as well. Now, one of the things that I've talked about over the years is the importance of after harvest, making sure that the fields are usually tilled right away, or somehow those plants are killed so that it reduces the inoculum that's building up late in the season that would be available for next year. Now, actually, this plant that's on the right, you can see that it's got this mosaic pattern from tobacco mosaic virus. It actually has a couple of lesions of blue mold on it, and more than likely has tobacco cyst nematode in the root system. So those three pathogens are building up on this one plant. And when you have a lot of sprouts surviving later into the season, we can get an extra generation of nematodes. It's building up a lot more virus particles, and it may be also being a source of potential overwintering for blue mold or other fungal or oomycete pathogens as well. So we need to make sure that at the end of the season, we're also killing those sprouts, which would add an additional management tactic at the end. So if I try to summarize what we found out over the last few years is that, soil health changes do occur, and they are positive. I think we're having an impact on the soil. If we continue to do this over time, the soil organic matter will gradually increase. We're seeing better reduced soil compaction where we're growing our tobacco. As a result, we're getting better water infiltration within the rows. And right now we can grow plants with the same yield potential as when we do conventional tillage. We just need to be able to deal with weeds, fertilizer placement, and some of these disease issues. And with that, I will stop and see if anybody has any questions.
Anyone who has a question, can you drop it in the chat if that's easy, or
however you
yeah.
want to deal with that, if you'd like to deal with it at the end.
Yeah, well, we have time for some questions right now. I had a question.
Sure.
I'm curious about, these are multi-year trials, and I'm sort of curious if the strip is being established in the same location each year, or if it's shifting.
The plots are in the same location. The strip is as close as we can get it.
Yeah.
So the intention is to have it in the same location.
Great.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right, Stephen has a question. He's asking, how would you kill the stalks after harvest?
Well, one way to do that would be if they start to come up, you could go over the top with Roundup or an herbicide. We don't have a lot of experience with this. Probably Andy could maybe give us a better better example of his experience and how best to do this. I hate the idea of going back through and tilling again to chop it up.
Yeah, normally that's the primary way it's done, but yeah, herbicides like Roundup, you could come in and kill that. Of course, once you get a frost, it's gonna kill off all that sucker growth that comes out. But yeah, tillage is the easiest way, but in terms of maintaining the no-till situation, it would need to be something like Roundup herbicide.
So this year, we just had a frost tough enough to kill our sprouts within the last few days. So, we've gone from most of the people harvesting their tobacco in August until November. So if those sprouts have, August and September, we've got a couple months, and that's certainly lots of time for pathogens to build up. So they have to be controlled somehow.
What about flail mowing? Could you flail mow them low, or do they just grow back?
I think they would just grow back. That's one of the problems with the stalk. They can if those roots stay alive, you can get resprouts from the roots. And actually, even if one of the things that we've talked about in the past is making sure that if you want to keep your nematode numbers relatively low and broadly, if you get about 1.5 generations a year, and after harvest, if you can chop those roots up and get the stalks turned so that the roots are exposed to the air, those nematodes all die. So we don't get a big increase. But if you let it go another generation, it can be much more damaging in the future.
One thing I just thought about, Jim, too, in our strip till here, we use an implement called a multivator. That's an in-row tiller that is basically used to freshen the strips. After we form the strips, we use this to kind of pulverize those strips. And so it's pretty intensive in the strip, but then you have, the no-till in the row middle there, but you could use something like that multivator to go in there and work just in the row to work those stalks up.
Yep. That would be a good way to do it, I guess. And sometimes it's hard to substitute tillage. And I guess if you're just tilling a strip versus the entire field, there's an advantage there as well.
Right.
Yeah, and I figure we know the intensity of tillage makes a big difference too, right? The speed at which, something that's that fast rotation, like a rototiller, is different than something that's just sort of moving the soil more gently. So I'm a big believer in shades of gray in terms of how bad tillage is, right? It's just different types, and if you can sort of pick the best one, that's good.
Right.
That's right.
We have another question here about side dressing. So how are you side dressing? So I think people are definitely interested in equipment and interested in incorporating fertilizer if possible. And I noted that you said you increased the percentage of pre-plant fertilizer. So I'm curious about how much you adjusted that.
Right. So that went up about, oh gosh, between the years, this last couple of years, we've increased it to the point where I think we are, instead of putting about half our fertilizer down pre-plant, we're putting about 3/4 down pre-plant. And then when we side dress, we have drop tubes that are directed right toward the base of the plant. So they're going into that cultivated strip. We don't incorporate it at that point. We're just dropping it right next to the plant. In many cases, it's going right over the leaves. But we're trying to get it as low as possible, right as close as possible to the plant.
Mhm. Yeah, we do a lot of, we use a lot of liquid nitrogen in Kentucky for side dressing, the same kind of principle. That's right within 6 inches of the plant, 6 to 8 inches. And that works well. And I'm not sure about the availability in New England of the same sources we use in Kentucky, but yeah, that's a good source. Ammonium nitrate works well if you can find that anymore. I don't know what the common sources are up in Connecticut, Jim, for side dressing and for pre-plant, but
well,
yeah.
We've been side dressing with the same meals that we use for pre-plant. We can, what's also commonly used here would be calcium nitrate as a side dress as well.
Yeah, that's
and
a
I
great.
think just getting it close to that loose soil, and then when we get rain, or it seems to work it in enough. And by doing that, I think we've solved the bigger issue of plants looking like they're hungry.
Mhm.
They respond just as well as they do in conventional.
Yeah, good.
I know some of the growers that I talked to were concerned about liquid nitrogen promoting off flavors in their tobacco. I wondered if you talked to anyone about that.
Yeah, people have, again, some of the meal fertilizers are expensive, and a lot of people have experimented with, using urea, or how much can they use, or other sources, or even some of the liquids. I think we've always had our best success and the highest quality when we use meals.
Great. All right, I think we're going to give Andy his time here, and then we'll have 10 minutes at the end for more questions. So just keep putting questions in the chat as you have them, and we'll get to them for sure. Thanks, Jim.
Okay. Let's see. Can you
There
see
we
my
go.
screen, Julie?
Yep.
Okay.
Looks
Is that
good.
on the, okay. And it's on presentation mode?
Yep.
Okay, great. Well, good to be here today. I appreciate you having me. Good to talk to you all. And a lot of what, the early slides I've got here, just you kind of reiterated some of the same things that that Jim and Julie talked about, the benefits of conservation tillage. We've done quite a bit here, probably more so with strip till than true no-till. I've got a counterpart in Lexington, Bob Pierce, that's worked more with no-till over the years. And but again, soil conservation, moisture conservation, field preparation savings is probably the biggest attracting factor to growers here in Kentucky, because we used to spend back, if you went back 25, 30 years ago, we were moldboard plowing, and then maybe chisel plowing in addition to that. And then there was several disc passes going on. And then finally a field cultivator going through there to really make a smooth field there for transplanting into. So we were making maybe 6 to 8 passes. And so any way to get around a lot of those is probably the biggest attraction to a lot of our growers here. And then once we get that crop established, having residue in that row middle allows for some timely field operations. If you get a big rain, we can get on that ground easier than if it were conventional ground. We've had some good crops no-till burley for sure here, and some good crops of no-till dark tobacco here. I hadn't had, I've been working with Connecticut broadleaf some for the last 4 years, but we haven't done any tillage work with broadleaf, but we have had some good crops over the years of burley and dark tobacco. We think we get cleaner leaf, which that would be a big plus, of course, for cigar wrapper crops, where you've got a residue there that can help keep that tobacco cleaner as it field wilts before you pick it up, and even before harvest, keep some of the splashing down that you get dirt up on lower leaves. Biggest things we think about with tillage, especially the way we used to till tobacco fields, is compaction, loss of soil organic matter that Jim mentioned, destruction of soil structure, and finally soil erosion is the most obvious thing that the public sees in some of these heavily tilled tobacco fields. And usually we see it's really sensitive if we get into a field that's a little bit heavy, a little bit on the wet side, and sometimes that may be only in some areas of the field are wetter than others at the time we do this. But thinking about some of these places like here, where you get really severely stunted plants, at first we've had some, undulation in growth from diseases like black root rot. But when you see a large patch of stunted plants, you go to poking around with a tile probe or a soil penetrometer, and you'll find some hard areas, usually in our soils about 6 inches down. And those roots are just sitting on that hard pan created by a disc pass, and maybe just one disc pass when that field was a little bit too wet. So early on, you'll see these signs of compaction where it's almost like the root system is trying to grow in just one direction, somewhat laterally. And then later in the season, you really see more obvious signs of that, where 5-6 inches down, you just have a pancake. They hit a hard spot, 5 or 6 inches, and they just started growing laterally there. And that really becomes a problem in dry years, where you have all your roots up on the soil surface there. Probably the biggest problem we've had, as far as the biggest deterrent to the expansion of no-till here in Kentucky, has been transplant establishment. Getting that crop started off on good footing, getting that crop transplanted well. And this is probably the hardest thing to explain to growers here, is that yes, we can, once we get a crop established in no-till, we can have more timely field operations, get on the field to spray a lot more timely than if it were conventional tillage after a rainfall. But early on at transplanting time, it actually takes longer under there for that soil to dry out compared to conventional tillage. So you think about this residue here, and you're waiting in the spring, you're getting a lot of rain a lot of times. You're waiting till that soil there is in good shape to transplant to where you can make sure that root ball down there is being covered, fully covered with soil in that transplanter. If it's a little bit heavy or wet, it's going to leave a gap there. It's not going to close. It's not going to close properly. And what happens, that root ball dries out where it's exposed to open air. So usually we found in our soils down here anyway, it takes about if you think you're ready to set tobacco in conventional tillage and you've got some no-till in the same situation, same soil type, it takes an extra 2 to 3 days in that no-till area for that ground to be ready under that residue, because it just takes that much longer to dry out under the residue. That's been the biggest problem here, as far as what's led to bad experiences with growers in no-till, especially, is just that waiting period, finding the discipline to wait that extra few days. Early on, we talked a lot about transplanters, and that's probably been the biggest thing that's helped no-till in Kentucky, is some of the transplanter technology we've seen in the past 6, 7, 8 years. Early on, when we were first doing some work with no-till, everything was just a modified conventional transplanter. And so we were adding things like a no-till coulter on that, just a small, a coulter in front of the setter there that would just cut through that residue. And then behind that, we had a subsoil shank, a short subsoil shank that would lift that area up a little bit and pull that transplanter shoe down into the ground there, and then loosen soil under that root ball. And then lastly, heavier press wheels than you might see on a conventional transplanter. A little bit wider press wheels, a little bit more of a leverage there to help press the soil around that plant that you wouldn't need in the conventional situation. But everything we did, again, was just a modified conventional setters. This is a mechanical 6,000 transplanter that we modified for no-till tobacco. It's got a coulter again, this short subsoil shank, and then the heavier press wheels. And this would work well if all the soil conditions were perfect. If everything was just right, we could do a good job getting crops established with this transplanter. But a lot of times they weren't just perfect, and we had some situations where we had some stand loss, and that's the first thing that'll really turn a grower off, is to see some stand loss that looks worse than he would have gotten if he would have worked the ground up. So again, the biggest thing we've seen that have had the greatest impact on no-till adoption here in Kentucky has been new transplanter technology. This is there's two, and there's actually probably several now, but the RJ Equipment no-till transplanter from Ontario was the first one that kind of came on the scene here. Really big, heavy transplanter that did a good job. Some really simple adjustments here as far as depth there on this transplanter that you can really do a good job under a wider range of soil conditions than with the modified mechanical transplanter that we used initially there. The Chechi and Magley transplanter that came on a little bit later is even better, I think, or at least as good as the RJ. A lot of different ways to adjust this transplanter. In fact, it took us a whole crop to figure out the adjustments on this thing when we the first one that we got here for use in research plots. So again, these have really had the biggest. If it wasn't for these two transplanters coming out, I think we would still be down in Kentucky at probably around 1 to 3% of our tobacco acreage in no-till. Now we're up to probably around 10% because of these transplanters mainly. So we did, again, these transplanters a lot better job in these different situations there where you could get good establishment even when things weren't perfect. But still, that same idea, you need to, it's going to take it a few more days for no-till to get ready to transplant it than it will conventional, at least on our silt loam soils here. Weed control, Jim mentioned weed control. That's been another challenge for growers. And of course, in conventional tillage where you're doing a lot of cultivation, we've got growers that used to cultivate, they would cultivate 4, 5, 6 times after they transplanted the crop, and they already worked that ground 6 or 8 times before they transplanted. And so they were getting a lot of weed control from cultivation. And so, and they were skimping some on the rates of herbicides. So we've done some herbicide work that shows, what the best systems are. And also we've learned in no-till, where we're not going to cultivate, and strip till, that we don't need to skimp on the rates of these herbicides. Go ahead and use as full of a rate as you can that your soil type allows. And Spartan and Command has been our best herbicide system in this regard. And a lot of growers don't like to use Command because of the damage to the wheat cover crop afterwards, especially if they're trying to harvest grain off that wheat crop the next year. But I'd rather see some damage on the wheat crop than see more weeds in the tobacco. So, and usually the wheat crop is definitely more of a cover crop than maybe a grain crop that they're looking for a major cash crop from. So we'd like to see the good weed control. Spartan Command is excellent. There are certain weeds that Spartan misses, like common ragweed for sure, that Command is very good on. So they work well together. This is just a picture of one of our weed control plots in no-till several years ago, a check plot, a lot of pigweed there, grass. nutsedge, and then of course fairly clean plot with a Spartan in command. We like to use with Spartan 4F, a full rate is going to be 10 to 12 ounces, a minimum 8 ounces per acre. There's also a Spartan charge formulation that's got a little, it has an extra component that's more of a burn down. Doesn't add a whole lot though to our situation, but a little bit less of the main sulfentrazone ingredient in Spartan charge. So 10, 12 ounces of Spartan 4F, but we would go up to 14, 15 ounces on the Spartan charge. Command 3ME, 2 pints at least to 2 and 2/3 pints. And that can actually work a little bit better if we split those and put out the Spartan before transplanting and then the Command within a week after transplanting. What that does for us is, where you go in with a transplanter, whether it be a no-till or conventional transplanter, you're going to disturb the soil right in the row. And so if you spray in that Command after transplanting, you're going to put something there where you've disturbed that soil, and that helps us with weed control right in the row. So that's the ideal way to do that. In some fields that we have questions about weeds, we might even add some prowl into that. We've had some 3-way mixes. If you're concerned about grasses, especially going into some of these sod crops or long-term sod crops, they're always a weed hole, it seemed like, here in Kentucky. And so we might even add some prowl to that. 2 to 3 pints of the old prowl 3.3. That would be more like 2 pints of the prowl H2O. Post-transplant, you don't have a whole lot you can do. This is probably one of the scary things about no-till is other than hand weeding, we've had growers go out with mowers and weed eaters, but that's really, it's pretty something that's tough to do. It's really better to get as good a weed control as you can up front. The only herbicide we have after transplanting is going to be post herbicide for grass control. 1.5 pints of post. We'd like to add crop oil with that because it's going to work best with crop oil for annual grass control. As far as broadleaf, so nothing we have labeled for that. It's got to be hand weeding or some kind of mechanical removal. Cover crops, we've done some work with cover crops. It's usually going to be a winter small grain, and really in our area, it's really hard to beat winter wheat for a cover crop for tobacco. Any cover crop is going to protect soil from erosion, suppress weed growth. You're going to see rapid growth in the spring that we don't want to get out of hand. We want to wait until we get enough residue there. When we kill it back, we're going to have a good residue, but you don't want too much there. It's going to make it difficult and kind of a hindrance for transplanting. This is just some work that Bob Pierce did looking at the same. This is the same tobacco, the same burley tobacco that was transplanted at the same time. The only thing different was the time that the winter wheat cover crop was burned down. This is 30 days prior to transplanting is burned down. You see less residue under there. 15 days here or more residue. And 1 day prior to transplanting, a lot of residue. And so the difference here, you see, this is all the same transplanting date, but it's the growth of the tobacco. So there's some, the more residue seems like the slower the growth is. I think in any case, you're going to see a little bit slower early season growth in no-till than you do in conventional tillage, just because that soil underneath the residue is cooler. In the end, it seems like it always catches up if all the conditions are good for growth, but you will definitely see, if you were to look at conventional and no-till side by side, you would see slower growth early in the season there. But then by up towards topping time, you would see everything kind of equalize. So we'd like to see our cover crop burned down about 30 days before transplanting. On the glyphosate label, you can do that at 30 days before. And then after that, gramoxone, paraquat can come in for no-till tobacco. And sometimes we might even do that twice. That can be mixed with our standard tobacco herbicides like Spartan too. And then we like winter cereals. Sod crops can work, but they're a little bit tougher to work with than winter cereals. We've done work with alfalfa, a lot with corn soybean residue. Really, in corn soybean, it's really just the weeds that have come up in that you're looking to control. And so not a whole lot there. It usually works pretty well, but we want to make sure we have some residue, if not a cover crop there from the previous corn soybean crop. Just a picture there, Austrian peas and winter wheat. We've worked with some crimson clover. This is just a table showing some of the crop characteristics of these different cover crops that we've worked with. The pluses would mean it's better. The minuses would mean can be a problem in some of these cases. And the 0 would mean a neutral, no real effect either way there. So, winter wheat for us has got the most pluses as far as ease of getting established, cost, fall cover, winter hardiness, and then the ease to kill in the spring if it doesn't get too big on us. And then transplanting into it is usually not a big problem there. Winter rye can work well too, but it can be a little more difficult to kill in the spring there. And we've had, when it's gotten too big, it can actually be a hindrance to transplanting sometimes. And again, some of the winter peas, crimson clover, there's some problems there with the winter hardiness on the Austrian pea, the cost of crimson clover. So for us, the winter wheat really has been, we keep going back to that as our standard cover crop for tobacco. Fertilization, Jim mentioned some, and just I'm not sure what the recommendations are for Connecticut, but here in Kentucky, for our burley and dark tobacco, 200 to 300 pounds of N per acre, and then our Connecticut broadleaf, it's almost half of that. We like a thinner leaf. It's a shorter growing season crop, so 150, 175 pounds of N. We use quite a bit of urea. We don't have the variety of nitrogen sources that we used to have for tobacco, say 20, 25 years ago. Things like calcium nitrate, at least for burley and dark tobacco, is kind of cost prohibitive here. A lot of urea that goes out for no-till. It needs to have a urease inhibitor with it though, because without that, if you can't incorporate it and you don't get a rainfall within about 2 days from application to the soil surface, it's going to start to get some loss. And so urea is heavily acidifying, so we like to make sure our soil pH is up where it needs to be, 6.4, 6.5, and then apply urea a week or two before transplanting. We've got some growers that will side dress and use it. That's going to be a UAN. And when I say liquid nitrogen, I'm talking about UAN, like a 32%, 28%, not some of the lower analysis nitrogen foliar feeding type products, but a UAN liquid nitrogen there, where we can put out, if you want to, our total nitrogen load could be with UAN. And we've got some growers that are doing that. That's just knifed into the soil surface there. And there's some growers that are putting out all their nitrogen post-transplant in that case in strip till and no-till here. Phosphate and potash, we follow soil test recommendations here, where some of our soils, if they've got high enough P and K, we don't recommend adding any. If we do add some, if we can band apply them, like Jim mentioned, we've got some growers that have these fertilizer hoppers on the stripper that's making those strips, and they can put it directly in the row. If we do that, we can reduce our recommended rate of P or K by 1/3. Insect pest, we think about if we have heavy residue, cutworms, some growers add orthene or acephate or bifenthrin in the setter water, or use a soil applied insecticide, which again is mainly bifenthrin or capture there. Other insects would be the same as for conventional, where you're putting out Admire or Platinum or Derivo, something like that, for control of flea beetles and aphids. And then of course, Coragen is one that we use here a lot for residual worm control at transplanting. Voles are something we see occasionally in the no-till, again, because of the residue, and they can be a problem. It's usually a localized problem, not through a whole field. And it's one that we don't have real good recommendations about how to deal with those in no-till, but they usually are pretty localized along the field edges, not a whole lot of yield loss there. Diseases, Jim's a lot more information than I do about diseases, obviously, but we think a lot about Phytophthora here, blackshank. I'm not sure if y'all even have blackshank in Connecticut, but that's our biggest disease here by far, soil-borne disease. And we use a lot of ridamil for that, although ridamil can be used in Connecticut too for even other things other than blackshank, like Pythium control helps with that too. So that may be something y'all use there, but trying to sanitize equipment, destruction of the stalks, again, that's what we talked about there a little bit ago. And that's, again, that's one of those areas where, for a pathology standpoint, we'd like to destroy those stalks, but for the soil health standpoint, we'd rather not till the soil. So it's kind of a difficult choice there. But I mentioned one thing that we do on our strip till. It's basically 2 implements that we use. And it used to be there's a lot of growers that would do this in the fall, but now it's more done in the spring, maybe a month out from transplanting, where they have the ripper stripper that actually it's got a subsoil shank in there, 2 coulters that cut that strip out, and then a set of double rolling baskets behind that makes that strip. But it's usually fairly cloddy behind that unless we run those twice. And then, so they'll come in before the transplanter with this machine called a multivator, which is basically an inline tiller that matches up with those strips. Those strips are about 16 inches wide, and then you've got no-till in the row middle, of course. And that's one thing that might be something to think about for destruction of those stalks after harvest, just in the row, where you're not tilling the entire surface area, but just in the row would be this multivator. But those are the 2 pieces of equipment that have really made strip till work for us here in Kentucky. Again, the fertilizer attachments, some people are putting out at least a P&K fertilizer as they make the strips. This is typical large acreages of strip till tobacco. This is after corn here in West Kentucky, dark tobacco. And it's, in a lot of cases, we feel like we're pretty equivalent on yield, where similar yield to strip till and no-till, and similar yield to conventional tillage. Some of our strip till observations here in Kentucky appears to be equal to full tillage for burley and dark tobacco. And in best cases, again, it's equal to no-till. Again, there's a little bit trickier with no-till than strip till about getting that ground in the best condition to transplant, making the judgment on when it's ready. Whereas with strip till, it's basically like conventional tillage in that strip, and you can even use a conventional transplanter in that strip. So it's a little bit more forgiving there. Need to have our transplants at the proper depth, good root ball, soil contact. Again, that's where it comes in on the waiting period there, especially with the no-till, making sure that it's not too heavy. It's going to seal up around that plant good. Early kill of the cover crop improves tobacco performance, but we don't want to kill it back so early that you don't have any residue left. That happens a lot here. We see fields that are strip till, but by mid-season you would never know because there's almost no residue left in that row middle. Right now, we've had some good adoption. Again, the biggest thing that's helped no-till has been these newer transplanters like the RJ shown here. Here in Kentucky and Tennessee, every grower that we have here, we don't have near as many growers as we used to have, but all of them are using cover crops, whether it be conventional or strip till or no-till. They're all rotating. Our burley tobacco is probably 5 to 10% no-till now, again, where it was probably less than 3% 15 years ago, before these new transplanters came out. Strip till burley is probably closer to 15%. And in dark tobacco, which is just in Western Kentucky, our no-till is about like the burley, 5–10%. But our strip till is probably at least half of our acreage now is in strip tillage. And so a lot of strip till adoption by dark tobacco growers. Conservation tillage, it's an emerging practice. We're still improving as we go. It's not suited for all soils here, but those best tobacco soils, well-drained soils, should do well for conservation tillage. Higher management, of course, especially thinking ahead and getting the cover crop burned down well in advance of transplanting. Not as forgiving, of course, where you're not using all this tillage equipment. We have to select our sites carefully based on weed pressure, soil type, past crop history, but it definitely is a practice that has gained a lot of momentum here in Kentucky, especially the strip tillage part. Again, at least in my area here, over half the acreage here is strip till dark tobacco. And with that, I'll stop, Julie, and answer any questions that anybody might have.
Great. Thank you so much. That's awesome. So I don't see any questions in the chat at this point. Anyone wants to pop a question in there, you can do that, or you can also just unmute yourself and ask, since there's a reasonable amount of us. Maybe while I'm waiting to see if anyone has any additional questions, I'll sort of put out the last thing that I wanted to share. See if I can let's work here. So I just wanted to share with any participants here that we have a small amount of funding to collaborate with Connecticut tobacco growers on this project, on experimenting with, oops, sorry about that, experimenting with, you know, soil health assessments, looking at an economic analysis of what strip till could look like on your farm. We have a little compensation for farmer time and trials. You know, we'd love to find someone who was interested in trying one of these conservation tillage or cover cropping practices and then holding an on-farm demonstration. We also have folks at AFT who are able to able to model changes in systems. So we could look at, if you're interested in sort of looking at what this would mean in terms of soil conservation, we could work with you on that. And I'll just leave here my contact information. So if any of you are interested or know another grower who might be interested in collaborating on this project, we have 2 years of funding. And I love to see more folks doing this in our part of the world. Emran, do you see any more questions that have come through?
No, excuse me. I'm seeing one from when Jim was speaking. I'm not sure if we got to it. What weed control methods are you using? But otherwise, nothing else.
Yeah. Jim, do you want to talk about that briefly?
Okay, so we rely a fair amount on prowl. So that's our primary one. We also will use command. We haven't used Spartan as much in our sandy soils. We've seen some that on our farm here. I know I've seen other some issues where Spartan can splash up onto the plant and cause some damage. But actually, if we have residue in place, I think that would reduce some of that splash of the Spartan back up onto the plant. So that might allow a better use of that herbicide without as much damage. But very similar to what Andy said, maybe that's why he wasn't followed up on us, because he answered that pretty well. I do see another question. Are you drawing in the new cover crop post-harvest? Yes. So once we do that, we get our cover crop in to stabilize that soil and get it growing. I'm assuming you do the same, Andy.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, it's drilled in after harvest. Yep.
Oh, and one thing I do want to make sure that I mention here is that there are some folks in Connecticut who are making no-till seed drills available for rent. So if that's something that you're interested in, we could connect you to that. And American Farmland Trust recently purchased one of the Chechi and Magley no-till transplanters. It's a 2-row transplanter, and we're happy to lend that out to farmers in Massachusetts and Connecticut who are interested in trialing that. And again, you can contact me, Julie, if you're interested in doing that. And I could also send you more specs on the no-till transplanter if you're interested.
Yeah, it's an excellent transplanter. We've had 2 of those, and I love it. It takes a while to find all the adjustments on it, but once you do that, it's a really nice transplanter.
Great. So I'm just gonna put my email address in the chat here, just in case anyone wants to write it down. And if we don't have any more questions, I'm just gonna thank our speakers and thank all the participants for coming today. I really appreciate sharing this information.
Thank you.
Thank you, Julie.
Thanks.
Good to be here.